Again, everyone. So today we're, of course, continuing our work on Island Beneath the Sea. Now, when I first did my introduction to this, I talked a lot about the history of Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and I touched briefly on Louisiana and New Orleans, just a few brief things. But now that we are in that section of the novel, I want to sort of step back a little bit and fill in some more background that, in some ways, some of it might be useful for you understanding events in this part of the novel. Beyond that, though, I think it's very helpful when we're reading a book like this that does cover such a large sweep of history. Um, you know, Even if we don't need the cultural background, the historical background to understand the events of the book, I think it will help give us a much larger appreciation of what's going on. So I want to talk a bit about Louisiana, French Louisiana, and New Orleans. Now, before I get into that, just a couple of quick bits of class business. Now, a few of you have posted to the Facebook group, based on your discussions. But I think it's like 3 people so far. So we've got a lot more people to check in. Um, I really do need the rest of you to post there. As I've mentioned before, this is an important part of class discussion, which is a major part of your grade. And while I am far away, this is one of the few ways I can sort of evaluate your class participation. So it is very important that everybody gets involved there. So last time I did one of these videos rather than Skype in, I asked for a volunteer to take notes on the discussion and send them to me. So that did happen, and thank you to that student. Your participation has been noted. That's another way I can monitor participation from afar. So I would like to ask for another volunteer for today. But also, beyond that, I would like to request that rather than emailing the notes to me, if you could please post them to the Facebook group. The idea is this will allow us to connect a little bit more. If I just see the notes, I get to sort of check in on what you guys are doing. But if they're on the Facebook group, I can comment, I can respond. If any of the students have their own input, they can do that as well. So whoever does volunteer, please do post it to Facebook. So let's move on to talking about Louisiana in the French period. Now, Louisiana was for many decades a colony of France. Today, I think I mentioned before, today there is a state in the southern United States, including the city of New Orleans, also called Louisiana. But at the time this was a French colony, Louisiana was a much larger territory, making up, I think it's something like about 15 to 20 states. So, about a third of the territory of the United States was all considered part of Louisiana. The part that became the state of Louisiana, that was the part that was most populated in the colonial period. So that's why it kept the name. Now, Louisiana was named for King Louis XIV, probably the most famous king of France, who he was known as the Sun King. He was considered one of the most glamorous rulers in the world. Now, in Island Beneath the Sea, we've heard a few mentions of Louis XVI, so a later king. Louis XIV, Louisiana was named after him. He was very famous, very beloved among some people. And Louis XVI, comes later on, and he was considered, not a very good king at all. He was considered very much out of touch with the people, and this was what sort of led to the French Revolution. Of course, in the novel, we've seen mostly the Haitian Revolution, but there have been some little hints of the French Revolution as well. It mentions the novel Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, getting their heads cut off. So all that's going on. So the Louis who Louisiana is named after would be, I believe, his grandfather. So originally, Louisiana was part of an even larger territory known as New France, or in French it would be Nouvelle France. So New France also included much of what is now the eastern part of Canada, particularly the region Quebec, which is today remains the French-speaking part of Canada. Now, the two main population centers were all the way in the south, New Orleans, like we've seen, and then maybe 2,000 miles to the north in what is now Canada, the cities of Montreal and Quebec. Now, in this period, the different colonial powers, mainly, the French, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, who had they had divided up North and South America between them. They were competing with each other, to gain the upper hand. So the French did not fare well in these struggles. I've mentioned again the French Revolution was going on around this time, so they had a lot of other problems besides these colonial struggles, which may have contributed to their defeat. So in the Spanish and the Portuguese were mostly in South America, Central America, Caribbean. Up in North America, what's now United States and Canada, these were primarily, well, the western United States was Spain, but that's far, far away from what we're dealing with. So in the eastern, what is now Canada and the eastern United States, the two powers were the English and the French. So they fought, several small wars with each other, a couple big ones, and in the year 1760. In the year 1760, France was defeated, and they were forced to basically give up the northern part of their territory, which is the part that, as I mentioned before, this is the part that is now eastern Canada. So once they had lost, this, which is where most of their settlers were, it became extremely difficult for them to hold on to the southern territories, Louisiana. Excuse me. So they couldn't maintain control. So just a few years after they lost their northern territories to the British, in the year 1862, they gave away the Louisiana territory to Spain. Again, they had other problems. They could not. They did not have the resources to maintain this colony, so they ceded it to Spain. So Louisiana remained a Spanish colony for almost 40 years, and at the time when this novel is taking place, Louisiana was a Spanish colony. So this is why you see characters like, for example, the priest Antoine. He's Spanish. So this is part of the Spanish influence. However, the numbers of Spanish colonists who moved to Louisiana were very small, much, much smaller than the French. So even though it was ruled by Spain, the culture, the language remained French. Now, in the year 1800, France regained control of Louisiana. They had a trade. So they gave a territory, a small territory, much smaller than Louisiana, a small territory in what is now northern Italy called Parma. They gave that to the Spanish, and in exchange, the Spanish returned Louisiana to them. This happens in 1800. So about 40 years after they lost it, they get it back. However, this is very much at the height, well, not the height of the French Revolution, but in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So at this point, Napoleon has taken over France, and he's reestablishing control, making France a military power again. But Louisiana is a huge territory. Like I said, 1/3 of the United States. It was thousands of kilometers away and across an ocean from France. And so, Napoleon was much more focused on Europe. His goal was sort of to conquer Europe, and he almost succeeded. So he decided to basically get rid of Louisiana. He got it back, and then he was like, you know what? No, I don't want this. So only 3 years after the French regained control, they sold it to the United States, which at the time more than doubled the size of the country United States. And so this happened again in 1803. I think where we've read through so far, I think we're up to about the year 1800. If I'm recalling correctly. So we're just very much on the verge of Louisiana becoming American. So one word that we've discussed a bit before, and that I'm sure you've noticed in the novel, is Creole. Now, I remember mentioning in class before that Creole can mean different things in different circumstances. Often it refers to some kind of a mixture of different cultures. Now, we see one meaning, the meaning specific to Louisiana in Island Beneath the Sea. We hear that that Hortense, Valmoraine's second wife, she comes from one of the oldest, one of the most respected Creole families of New Orleans. So in this case, what Creole means, a Creole, these are descendants of the original French settlers, the first French settlers who crossed the ocean, came to New Orleans. And their families founded the city, built the city, ruled the city. So the Creoles, at this point in history, they're very much the elite of the New Orleans society. They are wealthy, they own slaves, they own plantations, they, dominate the social scene, the local government. So being Creole, it means power, wealth, prestige. So, it mentions that, it's very unfortunate for Hortense that Valmoraine is not a Creole. That, he's only acceptable not being a Creole because he has so much money. Now, another group, we've talked about the Creoles, of course, obviously we have the slaves, and we have what was called at the time the mulattoes that we've talked about, similar to in Saint-Domingue, people of mixed race. Another group that I don't think has been mentioned much, if at all, in Island Beneath the Sea, but that is important, are the Cajuns. Now, Cajuns are another French-speaking people, French-speaking white people, like the Creoles, but there is a huge difference between Creole and Cajun in social class. Again, Creole, they are the elite, they are wealthy, they are slave owners. Cajuns, on the other hand, are very poor, and if Creole are up here, Cajuns are way down here in society. So, I mentioned before that France lost the northern parts of New France to England. And, there were several, major cities that they lost. So there are many, many people, French people living there who are suddenly under English rule. And one of those groups was called the Acadians. This is a group of basically rural farmers, rural French white farmers. And they were not very happy with British rule. They did not adjust to it well. And so the Acadians were forced by the English. They had to sign a loyalty oath saying they would remain absolutely loyal to England. They would, give up their ties, their loyalty to France, and only serve England. And thousands, some of them did go along with this, but thousands of them refused to sign the oath, and so they were exiled. They were kicked out of their territory. And so what many of them did, was to travel to the next nearest French-speaking place, which was Louisiana. So thousands of them basically made the journey from what is now Canada to Louisiana. And, like I said, they were called the Acadians, but in Louisiana they became known as the Cajuns. You can sort of hear the similarity, Acadian, Cajun, Acadian, Cajun. You can see how one term could become the other. So One other thing I wanted to mention is the ongoing influence of French culture and French history in modern day Louisiana. Now, as I mentioned, Louisiana was sold to the United States in 1803. So this is what 213 years ago. Very long time. Regardless, French culture, French history, the French language is still very much present in some parts of Louisiana. Now, in the city of New Orleans, there it's what's sometimes called Creole country. It's the Creole culture that remains dominant, and there are still many people in New Orleans, and often the wealthiest families, who are, New Orleans Creoles to this day. Now, one thing you might not expect, from what you see in the novel, the Creoles are these very wealthy, powerful white people who own slaves. So they're at the opposite end of the spectrum from slaves. Now, today, however, after over 200 years, actually many New Orleans Creole people are part black. The previous mayor of New Orleans, the mayor at the time of Hurricane Katrina, was a man named Ray Nagin, who was a black Creole. So at some point in their family history, there was intermarriage between Creole and between black folks. Now, the Cajuns, on the other hand, as I mentioned, these were farmers. So they came to the rural areas around New Orleans. So what is now Cajun country are the rural areas of southern Louisiana. And again, their culture, remains alive today. If you ever get to travel to that part of the world, I would highly recommend trying both Creole food and Cajun food. They're some of the most delicious food you'll ever eat. The cultures have suffered in some way. There are both Creole and Cajun forms of French, but they're not spoken nearly as much as they used to be. Cajun country also, New Orleans, where many of the Creoles live, was devastated by the hurricane, and it's very prone. It's very prone to all sorts of natural disasters, particularly hurricanes and floods. So that has been, very harmful on the descendants of the Creoles. Cajun country, they live in very low-lying areas, very flat areas that are near the ocean and that are in the river delta. So one thing they're suffering from very much, also the hurricanes, also the flooding, but they're suffering from actually the loss of their land, because much of the land is eroding. It's basically falling away into the ocean. And there have been thousands of square kilometers of land that has been lost. There are entire towns where people grew up that if you try to go there now, you can't, because it's the ocean now. Checking my notes here. So, and one thing I wanted to mention that might help give you a picture of Louisiana is that, not in terms of culture, not in terms of history, but in terms of geography and climate. There are actually many similarities between Louisiana and Bangladesh. They're very similar. Both of them are located in river deltas. Bangladesh, largest river delta in the world. Louisiana is located, southern Louisiana is located in the Mississippi River Delta, which is another one of the largest river deltas in the world. Both, very hot, very humid climates with, in America we don't use the term monsoon, but summer in Louisiana is very similar to monsoon in Bangladesh. Very hot, very humid, torrential rain all the time. Like Bangladesh, as I've mentioned, it's very prone to flooding. The rivers swell in the wet season, and there's a lot of flooding. It's very flat, like Bangladesh. Also, I would also say similar to Bangladesh, you have this division between urban and rural. Similar to Bangladesh, you have major problems of poverty. you have language issues, right? Not quite the same, but you have the French history, which is sort of French language has been sort of slowly dying. They weren't able to protect their language like Bangladesh was. So the final note I wanted to make about Louisiana and New Orleans is the central role it plays in one of the darkest chapters of American history. Now, I think I've mentioned before that that New Orleans in these days was one of the most important port cities in all of North America, maybe the most important one. It was a center of trade, which brought a great deal of wealth to the area, but it had a very dark side as well, because what was being shipped through the port of New Orleans, well, what they were shipping out was primarily cotton. In Saint-Domingue, the main crop grown by slaves was sugar cane, but in North America, cotton. So what they were shipping out was cotton that was almost entirely picked by slaves, like we've seen in the novel. And what was being shipped in, well, a lot of things, but the number one thing that was being shipped in were slaves. In the time of Island Beneath the Sea, New Orleans was already one of the major destinations for slaves being shipped from West Africa to North America. After it became part of the United States, by the year 1840, so 40 years after what we've been reading about, New Orleans had become the number one slave market in the United States. So more slaves were shipped into New Orleans and then sold than any other port in the entire country. And in the year 1840, there were over 50 different individual slave markets in the city of New Orleans. So 50 different places where you could go and buy slaves, all in the city. So, this is, the very dark side of the history here. I should say, we can see in the novel that in some ways slavery was not quite so brutal in Louisiana as it was in Saint-Domingue. But we shouldn't, and this tells us more about how brutal it was in Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was really the worst place in the world to be a slave. Louisiana seems a little bit better by comparison. But in the United States, Louisiana was basically, in the country, it was the worst place to be a slave. The most brutal climate, the harshest punishments, the harshest conditions, and it was the most difficult to escape. Because, in the United States, there was only slavery in the southern states. Northern states were free. So in Saint-Domingue, if a slave escaped, they would run to the mountains and join the Maroons. But in the United States, if a slave wanted to escape, they would run to the northern states or to Canada, where they could be free. But, if you were in one of the states near the border between North and South, a state like Maryland or Virginia, you had to travel, maybe 20 kilometers, maybe 100 kilometers to get to freedom. But from Louisiana, more like 1,000 or 1,500 kilometers to freedom. So you had to travel, all across the country. So, and, through slave territory where, all sorts of people were looking for you, trying to capture you, sell you back to your owner. So escape from a place like Louisiana was almost impossible for a slave. There was almost no chance of success. And if you escaped and were caught, you would be punished quite brutally. The slave catchers would have dogs attack you. You would be beaten. You would be whipped. And when you were returned to your master, actually, one of the most common punishments. Well, sometimes slaves would have their hands chopped off, but they didn't do that in other cases because that meant the slave couldn't do their work properly. So the most common punishment would be to have your earlobe cut off. Just the whole thing sliced off with a razor. This served several purposes as a punishment. Extremely painful, obviously, humiliating, but also for the rest of that slave's life, anyone who saw them would know that they were a slave who tried to escape. Okay, so this is basically the background that I wanted to share with you as we work through the New Orleans section, the Louisiana section. So let me fill you in on a few things that are coming up. For Monday, we will be continuing to read Island Beneath the Sea, and we will read through the chapter entitled Fear of Dying. Fear of Dying. Then next Wednesday, 1 week from today, that will be our final class on Island Beneath the Sea. So for next Wednesday, you should finish the novel. The week after that, we will be starting on our second novel, which is Anthills of the Savannah by Chinua Achebe. I'll say more about him in the future, but for now, I will just say Chinua Achebe is possibly the most famous, most celebrated, most important novelist of Africa. He came from a country in West Africa called Nigeria, and Anthills of the Savannah is the last novel he wrote. So we are going to be reading that starting in a couple weeks. And by the way, Island Beneath the Sea is by far the longest novel we're reading. All the other three are much shorter. So after we finish Anthills of the Savannah, we'll have our midterm exam. Hopefully I'll be there by then. I keep saying that. Out of my control. If I'm not there by that point, then we'll make arrangements. We'll figure it out. But hopefully I will be there, in the room with you while you take your exam. So I'm going to turn things over to Rebecca for the discussion portion of the class. Please remember somebody to volunteer for note-taking, and please remember to post those notes to the Facebook group. And I will talk to you all on Monday.